I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
The moment Prince William heard the name Prince Tom whispered through royal corridors, something shifted inside the future king. Not anger at first, but recognition. Recognition that this was not a mistake, not a joke, but a line being crossed. And what happened next would shake the monarchy in ways no one saw coming. It began quietly, almost too quietly for something that would soon dominate palace conversations from Kensington Palace to Buckingham Palace. A phrase, just 2 words, circulating in private gatherings, whispered between aristocrats, repeated with disbelief by aides who had served the crown for decades. Prince Tom. At first, it sounded absurd. Tom Parker Bowles was known in royal-adjacent circles as polished, articulate, even charming, a respected food critic, author, and television personality. But a prince? That title belonged to bloodline, to centuries of rigid structure, to a system that had survived precisely because it resisted sudden reinvention. And yet, the whispers didn't stop. What made it dangerous wasn't the claim itself, but the confidence behind it. Because those who heard Tom speak privately didn't describe uncertainty. They described certainty. A calm, almost calculated assurance that something had already been decided behind closed doors. That this wasn't ambition, it was inevitability. And in the monarchy, inevitability is power. The first detailed account reached William late in the evening, delivered not through official channels, but through trusted voices who rarely exaggerated. The setting. A refined gathering tied closely to Clarence House, a place deeply associated with King Charles III and Queen Camilla. The atmosphere, by all accounts, had been elegant. Soft lighting, measured laughter, the quiet hum of influence moving beneath polite conversation. But beneath that surface, something had shifted. A single moment. A single sentence. And suddenly, the tone of the entire room changed. Tom, standing among diplomats and longtime royal associates, had reportedly reacted sharply to a minor incident, something insignificant on its own. But what followed wasn't insignificant at all. He didn't just express frustration. He invoked status. Not current status, but future status. An honorary role. A position. A recognition that, in his own words, would place him closer to the royal core than ever before. And more importantly, he spoke as if it were already happening. Not being discussed. Not being considered. Happening. The effect was immediate. Conversations paused. Eyes shifted. The kind of silence that only exists in rooms filled with people who understand exactly what is at stake. Because within those circles, no one misunderstands the weight of titles. Titles are not casual. They are constitutional. They are symbolic. They are dangerous when misused. Within hours, the story began to spread, not through tabloids, not yet, but through the far more powerful network of private influence. Advisors speaking to advisors. Staff speaking in guarded tones. Names being mentioned carefully, as if saying too much could trigger consequences no one was ready to face. By the time the information reached William, it had already evolved from a strange comment into something far more serious. A pattern. Because this wasn't the first time Tom had hinted at something like this. According to multiple internal accounts, he had approached individuals connected to royal operations, financial figures, event coordinators, even those with indirect influence over public representation. And each time, the message had been consistent. That King Charles III had given his blessing. Not publicly, not formally, but privately. And that was enough to start shifting perception. Because in the monarchy, perception often becomes reality long before official confirmation ever arrives. When William heard that detail, that was the moment everything changed. Because he knew his father. He knew the structure Charles had defended for decades. The emphasis on a streamlined monarchy. The resistance to expanding titles beyond necessity. The careful balance between tradition and modernization. Granting even an honorary royal position to someone outside the direct line, especially someone with commercial interests, would not just be unusual. It would be explosive. And yet, no official denial had been issued. No clarification. No distancing. Just silence. And silence, in moments like this, creates space. Space for speculation. Space for ambition. Space for someone like Tom to step forward and let the world believe that the decision had already been made. William didn't react immediately. That was the difference. Where others saw drama, he saw strategy. Because this didn't feel like arrogance. It felt like positioning. Carefully timed statements. Repeated claims. The gradual planting of an idea until it no longer sounded impossible, but expected. And if that expectation grew strong enough, it could force the monarchy into a corner. Approve it and break tradition. Deny it and expose internal division. Either way, damage. Standing alone in his study at Kensington Palace, William began to understand the scale of what he was facing. This wasn't about a title. It was about control. About who defines the future of the monarchy, and who dares to rewrite its rules from the outside. And as more fragments of information began to arrive, one thing became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a challenge. And William had just decided he would not ignore it. What William didn't say publicly in those first hours would later become the most important decision he made. Because while the outside world waited for a reaction, inside Kensington Palace, something far more calculated was already unfolding. He chose silence. Not weakness. Not hesitation. Strategy. Because the moment he pushed back openly, the situation would explode into headlines. And right now, there was still one advantage he held over everyone else: clarity. He knew something didn't add up, and until he understood exactly what Tom was doing, he refused to make a single visible move. Instead, he began pulling threads. Quietly, carefully, and the deeper he looked, the more unsettling the pattern became. The first confirmations came faster than expected. Individuals connected to royal operations, people who rarely spoke out of turn, began admitting, in private, that they had been approached directly by Tom Parker Bowles. Not casually, not socially, deliberately. Each conversation carried the same underlying message, that King Charles III had already approved a future role for him. That discussions had taken place. That timing was the only remaining factor. And here was the detail that changed everything. He wasn't asking for support. He was informing them, as if their acceptance was expected, as if resistance would be irrelevant. When William heard that, he didn't react with anger. He leaned forward, because this was no longer about ego. This was about influence. And influence inside the monarchy doesn't spread randomly. It is built, step by step, through repetition, confidence, and proximity to power. Tom wasn't making noise. He was building legitimacy. The next development came late at night, unexpected, unverified, and dangerously precise. A short audio clip. 15 seconds. That was all it took. Circulating first in private networks before exploding outward, the recording carried a voice that no one could mistake. The unmistakable tone of King Charles III, calm and measured, speaking a single line that cut through the entire institution. "I will consider a suitable role for Tom in the future." No context, no explanation, just enough to ignite chaos. By sunrise, it was everywhere. Private groups, media backchannels, influential commentators quietly referencing it before any official outlet dared to publish. And then, as expected, the first headlines began to form, carefully worded, but loaded with implication. Had the king already decided? Was this the beginning of a new royal structure? Was tradition about to be rewritten? Inside palace walls, the reaction was immediate and fractured. Some advisors froze. Others panicked. Because if the recording was real, it suggested a decision made without consultation. A breach of protocol at the highest level. And if it was fake, then someone had just attempted to manipulate the monarchy itself. William listened to the clip alone. Once, twice, then again. Each time, his expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes hardened. Because he knew that voice. He knew the cadence, the discipline, the precision with which his father chose every word, especially in private. And something about this felt wrong. Not obviously wrong, but subtly off, like a sentence removed from its natural place. That was enough. He didn't debate. He didn't consult. He acted. "Shut it down," he said quietly to his closest advisor. "Not the headlines. Not the discussion. The source." Because whoever released that recording wasn't just spreading a rumor. They were applying pressure. And pressure, if left unchecked, forces decisions. Within hours, internal systems were activated, discreetly, without public trace. Digital teams began tracking the origin point, mapping how the clip moved, who amplified it first, which accounts pushed it hardest in the earliest minutes. And a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't random. It was coordinated. At the same time, William expanded his inquiry beyond the palace. Financial signals, private communications, unusual transactions, anything that could reveal whether this narrative had been engineered. Because by now, the possibility was unavoidable. This wasn't just Tom speaking out of turn. This might be something far more deliberate. Meanwhile, across London, reactions continued to spiral. Supporters of tradition pushed back quietly, questioning how such a shift could even be considered. Others, less bound by royal precedent, began entertaining the idea. An honorary role didn't seem impossible to them. Not in a modern monarchy. Not under evolving expectations. And that was exactly what made it dangerous. Because the more the idea was discussed, the more normal it began to feel. That was the real strategy. Not force. Normalization. If enough people believed it was already happening, then stopping it would feel like disruption, not correction. And that is how institutions are slowly reshaped, without a single official decision ever being announced. Late that night, William stood alone again in his study at Kensington Palace, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass. He replayed everything. The party, the statements, the approaches to advisors, the audio. And one thought settled in, heavier than the rest. This had timing, precision, escalation, which meant one thing. It wasn't impulsive. It was planned. And if it was planned, then there was a next step coming. Something bigger. Something designed to push the situation past the point of quiet control and into full public confrontation. William didn't know exactly what that step would be, but he knew who was behind it. And more importantly, he knew that if he waited too long, he wouldn't be reacting anymore. He would be responding to a reality that someone else had already created. For the first time since this began, his calm expression broke, just slightly. Not fear. Not uncertainty. Recognition. Because this was no longer a misunderstanding inside the family. This was a move. And now, for the first time, William was preparing to move back. The pressure didn't explode all at once. It tightened slowly, like a wire being pulled inch by inch, until every movement inside the monarchy began to feel restricted, calculated, watched. By the fourth day, what had started as a controlled internal concern had transformed into a full-scale narrative battle. One that was no longer confined to palace walls but spreading across media, private networks, and public perception with alarming speed. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior advisors found themselves walking a dangerous line between action and restraint. Every decision now carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. If they moved too aggressively, they risked validating the story. If they remained silent, they risked allowing it to solidify into accepted truth. The monarchy had faced scandals before, but this felt different. This wasn't a reaction to an event, it was an attempt to create one. At the center of it all stood Prince William, no longer observing from a distance but orchestrating a response with a kind of precision that revealed just how seriously he viewed the threat. The evidence gathered so far had confirmed his suspicions. This was not random speculation, and it was not harmless ambition. It was a coordinated effort to shift perception, to introduce an idea so persistently and convincingly that it would eventually demand recognition. But William understood something even more critical. Exposing the truth too early would weaken its impact. What he needed was not just evidence, but undeniable proof. Proof that would not merely silence the narrative but dismantle it completely, leaving no space for reinterpretation or doubt. And that proof was closer than anyone realized. Late that evening, within a secured chamber at St. James's Palace, William convened a meeting so restricted that even long-serving palace staff were unaware it had taken place. Phones were removed, access points sealed, and only a handful of individuals were permitted inside. These were not ceremonial figures or public-facing officials. These were the people who operated behind the monarchy's visible structure, the ones who understood how power moved when it could not be seen. William didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The tone in the room was already set by the gravity of the situation. He laid out the sequence step by step: Tom's statements, the repeated claims of private approval, the sudden emergence of the audio clip, and the coordinated spread that followed. Then he paused, allowing the silence to settle, before delivering the conclusion that shifted the entire room. This was engineered. Not suggested. Not suspected. Declared. The reaction was immediate but contained. No one interrupted, yet the weight of those words landed heavily. Because if this had been engineered, then it meant something far more serious than internal tension. It meant manipulation. It meant someone had attempted to influence not just perception, but the structure of the monarchy itself. From that moment, the strategy changed. William authorized a move that had been deliberately held back until now, a direct, targeted approach designed not to chase the narrative, but to corner the source behind it. Quiet messages began circulating through highly specific channels, reaching individuals who operated in technical fields rarely associated with royal affairs. Audio engineers, digital specialists, freelancers who worked in shadows rather than spotlight. The message was simple, but its implications were unmistakable. Whoever had created or altered the recording had a limited window to come forward voluntarily. If they did not, the full weight of legal and institutional power would be applied to uncover them. It was not a threat in the traditional sense. It was a certainty, and somewhere in London, that certainty reached the person William had been waiting for. Marcus Hale had not expected any of this. When he first accepted the assignment, it had appeared routine, an audio adjustment, a minor alteration using advanced tools that were increasingly common in modern media work. The instructions had been precise, almost disturbingly so. Replace a single word. Ensure the tone remains seamless. Deliver quickly. Payment guaranteed. There had been no indication of who the client truly was. No reason to question. Until now. As Marcus read the message circulating through his private network, the realization hit him with overwhelming force. This was no longer a simple job. This was the center of a royal crisis, and he was directly connected to it. The recording he had modified was not just circulating. It was shaping headlines, influencing opinion, and placing pressure on one of the most powerful institutions in the world. Panic replaced confidence almost instantly. Because unlike those watching from a distance, Marcus understood exactly how fragile the deception was. One original file, one comparison, one detailed analysis, and the entire illusion would collapse. By the following morning, the email arrived. It was not long. It did not attempt to negotiate. It confessed. Every detail was laid out with precision. The original recording, the instructions received, the method used to alter the audio, and most importantly, the source of the request. Attached were files that left no room for interpretation. The unedited conversation, the transaction records, the communication trail. And at the center of it all, one name. Tom Parker Bowles. When William read the message inside his office at Kensington Palace, the tension that had been building for days did not release in relief. It settled into something colder, sharper, more controlled. Because confirmation didn't end the crisis. It transformed it. Now, this was no longer about speculation or strategy. This was about consequence. Every piece of the puzzle had fallen into place with brutal clarity. The altered audio, the calculated timing, the deliberate approach to key figures. It had all been part of a single, coherent plan. One designed to manufacture legitimacy by creating the appearance of approval before any official decision could be made. And it had nearly worked. That was the part that lingered. Because if the engineer had not come forward, if the original recording had remained hidden just a little longer, the narrative might have reached a point where denial itself would no longer be enough to reverse it. standing near the window, overlooking the quiet city beyond, William allowed himself a single moment of stillness before turning back toward the desk. There was no hesitation now. No need for further investigation. Only action. But the action he was about to take would not simply expose Tom. It would send a message far beyond one individual. A message about boundaries, about tradition, about what happens when someone attempts to bend the monarchy for personal gain. And as William reached for the secure line that would connect him directly to his father, one thought remained at the forefront of his mind. This was no longer a private matter. This was a line that had been crossed. And once crossed, it demanded a response that could not be undone. By the time the truth reached King Charles III, the crisis had already passed its most dangerous phase, but not its most consequential one. Because while the manipulated recording had been contained internally, its impact had already spread across perception, reputation, and trust. And now, what remained was not speculation, but judgment. The message William sent was precise, controlled, and supported by evidence that could not be dismissed or softened. Every detail had been verified. Every claim backed by documentation. There was no ambiguity left, no space for interpretation. Only a single unavoidable conclusion. This had been a deliberate act of deception, carried out with intent, planning, and full awareness of its potential consequences. Inside a quiet villa in Provence, far removed from the political tension of London, Charles read the file slowly. The calm surroundings stood in stark contrast to what unfolded on the pages before him. The original recording, the altered version, the confession, the financial trail. Each piece layered upon the last, forming a narrative that became impossible to ignore. As he reached the final page, something shifted. Not confusion, not disbelief, but a controlled, unmistakable anger. Because this was not an attack from outside the institution. It had come from within the extended circle of the family itself, carried out by someone who understood enough about the monarchy to know exactly where its vulnerabilities lay. That knowledge made it more dangerous, not less. It meant the action had not been careless. It had been calculated. Within hours, against medical advice and the caution of his advisors, Charles made his decision. He would return to London immediately. The risk to his health was acknowledged, but dismissed. Because what had been challenged here was not just a rumor or a personal matter, it was the credibility of the crown itself. When his aircraft touched down and he was driven directly toward Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere awaiting him was heavy, controlled, and deeply tense. Staff moved with quiet urgency. Conversations were short, deliberate, and carefully guarded. Everyone understood that what was about to happen would define how the monarchy responded to internal breach at the highest level. Inside the private study, Prince William was already waiting. For a moment, there were no words exchanged. The silence between them carried more weight than any immediate reaction could. Then Charles stepped forward, placing a hand on William's shoulder, not as a formality, but as acknowledgement. What had been managed in his absence had been handled with restraint, intelligence, and discipline. And now, together, they would finish it. The meeting that followed was unlike any routine royal discussion. It was not about ceremony, public appearances, or policy. It was about containment, accountability, and the preservation of institutional order. Present in the room were only those whose roles extended beyond visibility. Individuals responsible for safeguarding the monarchy not in public view, but in moments exactly like this. And then, finally, the name was spoken aloud. Tom Parker Bowles. Not as speculation, not as rumor, as fact. The evidence was presented without dramatics, because none were needed. The original audio played first, clear, contextual, unmistakable. Then the altered version followed, identical in tone but fundamentally different in meaning. The contrast alone was enough to shift the entire room into a deeper, colder silence. No one interrupted. No one questioned. Because there was nothing left to question. When Charles spoke, his voice carried none of the uncertainty that had defined the previous days. It was steady, measured, and final. He made it clear that no title, honorary or otherwise, had ever been considered for Tom. That no authority had been granted. that the claims made publicly and privately were entirely fabricated, and most importantly, that the manipulation of royal communication, whether through media, technology, or influence, would not be tolerated under any circumstance. There was no anger in his tone, only authority, and that made it far more powerful. The implications of that statement were immediate. What had once been an internal investigation was now transitioning into formal response. Legal teams were activated. Communications units prepared controlled statements. Internal networks began the process of severing every remaining connection between Tom's professional activities and any perceived royal association. Meanwhile, in a separate residence far from the controlled environment of the palace, Tom began to understand what had happened. The call he received was brief. There was no negotiation, no opportunity to explain, only information. The engineer had come forward. The original recording had been secured. The financial trail had been confirmed. For the first time since this began, the confidence that had defined his actions began to fracture. Because the entire strategy had depended on one assumption: that perception would outrun verification. That by the time anyone questioned the claim, it would already be too embedded to dismantle. But that assumption had failed. Completely. And now, what remained was exposure. Back inside Buckingham Palace, the final stage of response was set into motion with the kind of precision that only emerges in moments of institutional threat. The public statement was drafted not as a reaction, but as a correction. Every word chosen carefully. Every sentence structured to eliminate ambiguity. When it was released, it did not attempt to dramatize the situation. It clarified it. There were no plans to grant any role or title. The circulated recording was manipulated. Legal action would follow. And with that, the narrative shifted. Not gradually. Instantly. Because once the truth was backed by evidence, supported by authority, and delivered without hesitation, the speculation that had fueled the crisis lost its foundation. Media outlets adjusted their tone. Commentators recalibrated their positions. Public reaction turned sharply, not toward confusion, but toward accountability. And at the center of it all stood William, no longer operating in the background, but recognized, quietly, unmistakably, as the figure who had identified the threat, contained its spread, and brought it to resolution before it could permanently damage the institution he was destined to lead. But even as the immediate crisis came under control, one reality remained impossible to ignore. This had come from within proximity to the crown. Not an external adversary. Not an unknown force. Someone who had access, awareness, and ambition. Which meant the lesson extended beyond one individual. It revealed a vulnerability. And vulnerabilities, once exposed, are never forgotten. As the palace settled into a controlled calm and the machinery of response continued to operate behind closed doors, one question lingered beneath the surface. Not how this had ended, but how close it had come to succeeding. The fallout did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It arrived with precision, with silence, and with the kind of controlled force that defines how the monarchy protects itself when its core is threatened. By the time the public fully understood what had happened, the decisions had already been made behind closed doors, executed with a level of efficiency that left no room for reversal. Within hours of the official statement, the shift was undeniable. What had once been whispered as possibility was now exposed as manipulation. What had been defended by speculation was now dismantled by evidence. And at the center of that collapse stood Tom Parker Bowles, no longer a figure operating in the margins of influence, but the subject of a narrative that had turned sharply and decisively against him. Inside Buckingham Palace, the response did not escalate emotionally. It tightened structurally. Every connection that had even loosely linked Tom's public identity to the royal institution began to disappear. Invitations that once arrived without question were quietly withdrawn. Professional associations that had benefited from proximity to the crown began distancing themselves without announcement. Charitable roles faded, endorsements dissolved, and the subtle advantages that come from royal association were removed with clinical precision. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public humiliation, only distance. And in the monarchy, distance is consequence. For Prince William, this moment was not about victory. It was about restoration. The institution had been tested not through open attack, but through calculated internal pressure, and the response had required something far more difficult than force. It required patience, restraint, and timing precise enough to ensure that when the truth emerged, it would not be questioned again. Standing once more in his study at Kensington Palace, William reviewed the final reports as the situation stabilized. The digital spread of the altered recording had been contained. The source had been confirmed. The narrative had been corrected. From the outside, it would appear as though the monarchy had simply clarified a misunderstanding. But that was not what had happened. What had happened was far more serious. A line had been tested, and then reinforced. Because the real danger had never been the title itself. It had been the method. The attempt to create legitimacy through repetition, to force recognition through perception, and to apply pressure in a way that could have cornered the monarchy into making a decision it never intended to make. That strategy had nearly worked. And that is what made the response so critical. Meanwhile, far from the controlled environment of royal residences, the reality began to settle in for Tom. The confidence that once defined his movements had been replaced by isolation. Calls were no longer returned with the same enthusiasm. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. Opportunities that once seemed inevitable vanished quietly, leaving behind a silence that was impossible to ignore. For the first time, the consequences were no longer theoretical. They were personal, and they were permanent. Back within the royal structure, King Charles III made one final position unmistakably clear to those closest to him. The monarchy would not expand under pressure. It would not alter its structure in response to external influence, no matter how close that influence came to the family itself. Tradition would evolve, but only through deliberate, controlled decisions, not through manipulation. That message carried beyond the palace walls. Because what had been exposed here was not just an individual's ambition, but a broader truth about power itself. In an institution built over centuries, authority is not claimed. It is granted. And any attempt to bypass that process, no matter how carefully constructed, will eventually face the full weight of the system it tries to outmaneuver. As the days passed, public attention began to shift, as it always does. New headlines replaced old ones. Conversations moved forward. But inside the monarchy, the impact of what had occurred did not fade. It settled into memory, into protocol, into the quiet adjustments that ensure such a situation cannot unfold in the same way again. Because the most important changes are rarely announced. They are implemented. Silently, decisively, and permanently. For William, the lesson was clear, and it would shape every decision he made moving forward. The future of the monarchy would not be defined by reaction, but by control. By understanding threats before they fully emerge. By acting not at the height of crisis, but just before it becomes irreversible. Because this time, the system held. But next time, the challenge could come from somewhere less visible, less predictable, and far more difficult to contain. And that raises a question no one inside the palace is willing to ignore anymore. If a single altered sentence could come this close to reshaping perception, what happens when the next move is even more sophisticated? That is the question that now lingers behind the polished image of stability. That is the question that defines what comes next. And that is exactly why this story is far from over. If you followed every twist of this unfolding royal drama, you already know, this isn't just about one incident. It's about power, perception, and the invisible battles shaping the future of the crown. So tell me, do you think this was simply ambition gone too far? Or a calculated move that almost succeeded? Share your thoughts below, because your perspective matters more than ever in moments like this. And if you want to stay ahead of the next chapter before it breaks, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and watch the next video on your screen right now, because what's coming next might be even more shocking than anything you've just heard.